Hey, welcome to the Table Talks Podcast. My name is Tim. I'm here with Pastors Filipe and Mandy. And today we're unpacking more in this journey of our series, Wonderfully Made. We're talking about sexuality, desire, gender, longing, all kinds of fun things. So we're here to unpack week 2 of our message around sexuality. So you guys just came out the stage. I know you had probably 50% or more of notes that you didn't get to share in your message. So we're going to unpack some of those things. Yeah. So thanks for being here. Thanks for doing
you're welcome.
Yeah. So we're going to start off. You set up a lot of groundwork around the culture of today around sexuality and where it's come from and what's led to today. And a lot of that had to do with the sexual revolution that happened. Can you speak a little bit more into some of those things that you didn't get to unpack in it?
Yeah, what we didn't get to is actually, it started before the sexual revolution. So like in the 1900s, in fact, I'm going to read some of my notes I left out. It started with Freud, who had a theory that the chief cause of psychological problems in society was sexual repression. In other words, if you hold back on desire, you're crazy, is what he was trying to say. Or you'll be dysfunctional, might be a better way of saying it. And then in the 30s, it went even beyond that with, I don't know how to pronounce his name very well, but it's Wilhelm Reich, I think he's an Australian doctor, a psychoanalyst. Austrian, sorry, yeah. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, big difference. And he agreed with Freud, but he went farther and he had influences by Karl Marx, by the way. He believed that all moral codes reinforced the patriarchal family, which was just trying to maintain power and be oppressive, and therefore should be abandoned all entirely.
It's also good to know that he did end up in jail. So some of his practices were also not, but he did have influence in society, and that's notable with this timeline.
Yeah, both of them had huge influence. One saying, don't hold back, and the other one saying, morality doesn't matter. And then later in the 60s is when we have now the sexual revolution, which happened primarily as the momentum builder came with the release or the innovation of the birth control pill, which then everyone's like, oh, now we can have sex with no perceived consequence, right? So all the unwanted pregnancies and diseases that people kind of, in some cases, the fear of it kept them back. Yeah. Now it was gone. And so it rapidly increased sexual activity in society and normalized it. And then we talked about how the internet and mobile devices and all that stuff made it even more accessible and private. So that had a huge impact in society as a whole. And most people, used to think at least all of that was really good, like it's like more freedom, but we learned it's actually not good at all. In fact, a lot of that like unhindered sexual activity that was promised to bring fulfillment tanked society's happiness and brought a lot of anxiety, depression. And then, Louise Perry talks a lot about this in her book.
I read it front to back, and I think that what's so heartbreaking that she talks about is how we have so many women now, because of this influence, are given this message that they actually need to act like men. So both she goes into like male sexuality and what's common among men. And then she shifts that to the pressure women feel to have to try to match that. So both sexually, but also in the workforce and all kinds of different places of life it's influenced. And so it's just really fascinating research. She is, she's not a believer. So we have to take that when we listen to her stuff, but it's just fascinating on the research side, the impact just in society and the pressures that women are coming up against. It is actually very heartbreaking. Yeah. So if you can stomach the book, it can come across brutal and very harsh, but it's very eye-opening to see how we've gotten here. And honestly, my heart's just really tender toward especially women in their 20s and 30s who've maybe grown up and gone to college in this kind of atmosphere. It's really sad.
Yeah. So let's double click on that a little bit. Like you talked about how like the sexual revolution, all these things have started to make it so that sex would become inconsequential, right? It's cheapened it in a way. Yeah. And you kind of set up your message in saying we need to elevate and like restore the sacredness of this sort of intimacy. So there's a lot of commentary we can make on that subject, right? We could talk about the politics of it, and we could do a whole podcast on that. We could talk about how the church has been a problem in this as well. But I think maybe for people to be a little bit more practical, what does it look like for us individually? Like, how do I restore this sense of sacredness of intimacy and sex for me as an individual?
Yeah.
I think the primary thing is we need to invite God into that space.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people connect sexual activity with sin and wrongdoing and shame and guilt and pain, we then put sex on one side and God in another. And what happens with that is the creator of the thing is no longer a part of that thing in our lives, and it minimizes it. One of the biggest griefs actually for us, like we do a lot of premarital counseling, and over the years, we've seen so many people that get into marriage not even understanding that like in sexual activity, God is present. Because for so long, they like push God to the side to have sexual activity outside of his boundaries. And so one of the things that we do the most is just showing them like, no. Like it is very special. Like you together and the Holy Spirit will be in sexual activity, and he will enhance, he will beautify, he will be present. It's not like God is out there and then we have sex in the dark. God can be a part of that part of your life. And even if you're not married, right? Like I think inviting God into that space helps you know how to be pure. It helps you know how to have boundaries and not just do it because of guilt, but because of what you long for in him. Yeah. So it's just a different paradigm to experience.
Yeah. I think it for me, even just studying this, it's just renewed my own vision for sexuality, having been married 21 years, and we've had a great marriage. But I think God has so much more for us, and even our understanding of it. And there's so much mystery in this, that I think is there for a reason. Because if we try to articulate it, we have this human way of trying to like harness something and control it and make it a formula so we can guarantee it in our lives. And God doesn't work like that. He's not going to be controlled. And I think this is something that only comes in relationship with God. And I think for many of us, or many who grow up in the church, maybe understand that a relationship with God is significant. But I think this connection, this sense of like being in God's presence, there's something in even talking about it. I feel like words are just inadequate because it's hard to understand. But when you look throughout all of the Bible, that union word is everywhere. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like this, when you understand union with God, and this is meant to reflect a marriage relationship, it's everywhere. And it's like, how have we missed this? You know, like we kind of reduce talking about sex to a few verses in the Bible to kind of back up our understanding of how it works. But really the imagery and the message is everywhere. And so I think in relationship with God, he helps us see a bigger vision for it. And when you start to see it, like even for me in the last few months, it's everywhere. It's like, wow, it's way bigger than even I thought. So it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. You talked about boundaries as a part of that process.
Yeah.
And boundaries are meant to essentially keep us from like giving into temptation of desires within us.
Yeah.
But I think there is a question that we hear a lot is if those desires are within us and God placed them or at least allowed them to be within us, why would he do that if we're not allowed to pursue them?
Yeah. It's a great question. By the way, if you missed David Bennett's event, you should go. It's on the YouTube channel.
Yeah,
right?
We'll link it in the description.
Yeah, he talks about this a lot as a same-sex attracted Christian, what it looks like to surrender desire. And that's a question that came from the audience. I mean, ultimately, we talked about how sex is an icon, and it's meant to point us to God's desire to be near to us. And so that is really the answer to that is our desires are not necessarily there so that we can try to fulfill them all with our own attempts to fill the gap. It's meant to be fulfilled in Christ. And not every desire is inside of us because of the Spirit. Some desires inside of us because of the flesh, which is, we're going to unpack this next week, but just because you have a desire doesn't mean that you should pursue it. If I pursued every desire, I would have 35 wives and 150 kids. And, because someone wrote me, I know this is kind of weird to say, but someone wrote me an email this week and said something about like, how can someone who comes to Jesus still have, sexual desire that is like this, like what they consider to be sinful? And I was like, I've come to Jesus and I still have a lot of desires contrary to his will.
Yeah.
And that's why the Spirit is in me to give me self-control to not lean into my desires that can be destructive. So all that to say, just because you have a desire doesn't mean God gave it to you. We ought to redeem those. And part of those is actually what we call, they come from the fall, from sin entering humanity. You might have a better answer though.
No, but I think that's great. But the battle over our desires is how we got sin in the first place, right?
Battle.
That's where Adam and Eve first gave into temptation, was that the desire. And ultimately, this is like the ultimate, it's David Bennett's title, The War of Loves inside of us is, do I love myself? Do I trust God? Do I love God? And in that, it's trusting that there's some things that are happening around me or within me that God's asked me not to follow or to pursue. And do I trust God? Am I committed enough in my relationship with God that I'm willing to take him at his word, that he will fulfill me? Or give in to that temptation or that desire that does step out of that boundary. And when we step out of that boundary, we're the ones that suffer.
Yeah.
Like God's there waiting, like, wants to forgive and restore. But every time we step outside of those boundaries, it's us who gets harmed. We're the ones in the confusion and the pain. And so it's like the natural consequence. If you step outside of the way God created it, there will be pain. And in a fleeting moment, maybe the fulfillment of a desire might feel good, but the ultimately it will leave us in brokenness and pain. And I think we see that all around us, that attempt to try to satisfy those desires without God is futile. It really doesn't lead to a satisfying life.
In Galatians 5, it says, those that belong to Christ have nailed their passions and desires to the cross of Jesus. And it's not like nailing because now we can't have any desire or passion. It's because we trade it for something incredibly better and is deeper, more significant. And there's a longing that God gives us and a completeness that is worth the trade, basically.
Yeah.
I think too, in the New Testament, reading the Gospels, and it feels like it's probably in all of them, so I don't want to isolate one, but Jesus invites the disciples, he says, follow me. So they follow him. And somewhere in the middle towards the end, it's like, if you want to be my follower, you have to take up your cross, right? Like there's a suffering involved in following me. So like he invites everyone in, all of us, he wants to be with him. But to follow him all the way, it's ultimately to sacrifice, and sacrifice with him is kind of the calling for all of us. And that's how it, I think, manifests itself. It's in those fleshly desires that we so badly crave, and sacrificing that, the trade-off for him. When we start to experience that trade-off, I think, though, is where we start to get it, like, oh, it is worth it.
Yeah.
But maybe the first few tries of like, God, are you sure? Like, I don't know if I can really, if that's true. And I would just say, try it. Because when you hear these stories, and even in my own experience, God truly will meet us in those needs and those desires if we will give him space to do it.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things. Like there's the, I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about, like, it's not that we pursue our desires too much, is that we settle for desires that are lesser than what God desires for us.
Yes.
The second thing too, I think, is in light of all of eternity, it's a sacrifice for a period, for a fulfillment for all of eternity.
Yeah. David Bennett says this quote that's powerful. He says, I choose to live in the future. Yeah. And for him, it was like my submission and surrender of same-sex desire in exchange for the pleasure I get in Christ and the fulfillment of living for him is nothing compared to what I'll gain in eternity. And so he's like, so I choose to live in the future. Sacrifices of today are worth it in light of the bigger picture of eternity.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
All right. You talked a little bit about the prohibitions in the scriptures around sexuality. Mandy, you talked about how it says to avoid divorce, to run from sexual immorality, and abstain from same-sex activity. So you even you said those statements that the Bible states, they can be offensive, they can be restrictive. And I was going to add one word to that as well. They also seem unfair.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing for me to say to somebody, hey, you have to wait till marriage to have sex. It's another thing to say, hey, you cannot act on any of your same-sex desires forever, right? You cannot engage in those desires for you for this whole life.
Yeah.
And that seems unjust.
Yeah.
So how do you talk to somebody and explain that to someone who is struggling in that area?
Yeah. Well, I think my first response would be that it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. Like, God's love is worth that trade-off. And though it seems unjust, the injustice of it is a result of our own human sin. And whether that sin, sin can be very complex because so often, that's a whole rabbit trail, right? But I've heard it said that's really helpful for me to see it in the layers is that we have sin in us, done to us, and then around us. So often, and even when it's a sin that's misaligned with God, so same-sex attraction, right? It's hard for me because I don't have this as a personal experience that in that way, but I can think of other desires or things that I have that I know is contrary to God and see, okay, what do I do with this? God asked me to trust him with it. And I think when I look at the way God comes to his people, God first, so the 10 Commandments, for example, came 400 years after God initiated a covenant with Abraham. So God, when he first comes, he doesn't lay down the rules and say, here's all the things you have to do to follow me. Yeah. The first act he did was he rescued them from slavery, got them out of slavery. He saved them. And then it was so you could use the marriage language. He married the nation of Israel and they enacted a covenant that, here are the terms of the covenant. And the people were like, yes, we want to do everything you say. And what did they do? Nothing. Moses came down from the mountain and they were worshiping another idol, there. So it's there's this battle in our human nature of sin. And so all that to say, does it feel unjust? Yes. Is it? I think when we understand who God is and experience his love and walk with him, he shows us those disordered desires, the things that he didn't create those in us, but he doesn't stop them. Yeah. And I think he asks us to trust him with them. So yes, it can feel restrictive. I think the church within a good attempt to try to combat things like the sexual revolution, the church has put so much emphasis on the boundaries and the don'ts that we don't even know what it's meant for. So even talking with people who are married, go into their marriage and they intuit or they know up here in their minds that sex is good, but they don't know how to shift to experience and feel freedom in their marriage. That is so sad and heartbreaking. And that is at the expense of the church not giving a bigger picture of it and just focusing so narrowly on the boundaries. The boundaries are for our protection, but sex is meant to, like we shared, be the window and resemble our relationship with God in a way. And I think it minimizes our relationship with God when we focus on the boundaries.
Can you add to that?
Yeah.
Like you also talked about how people can experience that kind of intimacy with God outside of sexual relationships.
Yes, it's
so what
very
does that
important.
look like?
Yes. Yeah. That's a great question. Maybe you should give it.
It's so complex, this stuff, Jesus was single, Paul was single, and there's many examples.
And they both say it's better to be single, actually.
And, singleness is elevated in the Bible, and celibacy is elevated. And you can make a case it's elevated above marriage even oftentimes, where Paul says, if you're single, you can devote yourself to God with no distraction. And so there's something beautiful about that. I forgot the original question.
Like how can you experience that kind of intimacy outside of?
Well, I think you can have the icon without having to live out the expression of sex like a married couple would have. And so you display to the world the beauty of relationship with God. You display what intimacy with God brings to your life. You display that proximity to God brings a climactic fulfillment to your life like sexual activity would. And so there is so much more to it. It doesn't mean that you have to be married in order to display what God is trying to reveal to humanity about his longing to be near to us. You can do that as a single person. And we have many here at Echo who display that really well, and they have great friendships with people. They understand that their longing that they have and their desires are really there to point them to their Creator. And so they pursue that, and they're very fulfilled in their God in that way. And it's very beautiful to see.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. It's probably good to know. I don't know. It just came to me too in this. There has been an idolization of romance and marriage and culture in a way, even not even in the church. Like, yes, it's part of the church too, but watching movies, I can think of the 90s, the rom-coms, and like just the stereotypical rom-com movie. It just elevates and idolizes romance. And I watched, You've Got Mail with one of our daughters last night. It's the classic movie, but getting ready to teach this today, I'm watching it like, wow, like the messages of what it's sharing. It's like, I would just have these memories. This is such a sweet movie. And I'm like, wow, why is it sweet? Like what is being really pushed? And it's so clear. And yet it's something we long for, that connection. And so even in this topic, I think what keeps surfacing also is friendship. How do we connect with other humans? How do we be in relationship? What does intimacy in relationships look like? Because of the idolization of romance and the sexualization of culture, even with the Me Too movement, so many things, so much of our ability to connect well and appropriately and also deeply has been fractured. And so I think some of this challenges that, like, what does friendship look like without physical intimacy, And I think there's so much more we have as a church to learn how to model that and to engage in that with each other, where relationships are not contractual, like you do this for me, I do this for you, or sexual. Like it feels like so many relationships end up in those types of things. But the beauty in the church is the body of Christ coming together and really knowing how to be in community together in healthy friendship. I think it challenges that. And it's an area we need to be challenged in and work out in new ways.
Yeah. So we put a ton of resources, books, podcasts, and things together for this whole series. I'll put a link below and it'll be in the lower third here for you to see the link. Are there some specific resources that we have on this topic that you would highlight from that? Because it's a lot to sort through.
Yeah. Probably Josh Butler's book, Beautiful Union, especially I would say for couples who are married or pursuing marriage or want to be married. If you fall in that category, I think it does a really good job trying to put language and articulate some of these things that we're talking about today, that it feels like language isn't adequate. I think he does a good attempt at that. And a lot of his work comes from actually Pope John Paul II's book, Theology of the Body. I'm working through one of a book that explains it. It's actually a commentary on it. It's, yeah, I've not gotten all the way through it, but what I have been reading has been deeply moving for me. It is what is helping me find language to express some of these things. And the fact that it has come from the Catholic tradition is actually convicting to me, and also opens my eyes to a side of the church that maybe some of us who fall on the Protestant side seem to block out. And just his contribution to this conversation, I think, is huge. In the commentary, Christopher West, he actually writes that this, I think the phrase is like, it's a ticking time bomb waiting to go off in a future generation. And I'm hoping that's now. I'm hoping that, because what Josh Butler's book in some way is a Protestant attempt to talk about some of those things that have been part of the Catholic Church actually for a couple of decades. And it's actually really powerful. So.
Yeah, that's cool. I would also highlight just David Bennett's story.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
His book that we've all been reading as a staff.
Yeah.
We did an interview with him. It's also on our YouTube channel. I think that's a really great resource to check out. It was incredibly
moving.
moving.
Everyone. I think, it challenges every human person.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks so much for joining us, for sharing. I know you guys worked really hard on this message and you poured over every single word. So it means a lot to do this with care and intention and love for our people who are listening. I hope that you were encouraged by this. Make sure you join us next week on Sunday. We're going to be talking about desire, longing, and singleness and what that looks like in our lives. Check out all the resources on our resource page. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything moving forward. And we'll see you next week. Bye.